All right, you all. So, did the clickbait work? Are you here for the title? So if there's one thing certainly I'd like you to learn and take away is what hyperstition is. So let's try to get to it. If you went all the way and read the description of the session, and I tried to break down what really we want to try to do today. And in a sense, I want to talk about the credentialing ecosystem in a slightly different way. Effectively, also as a failure of a human coordination. But just to spoiler everything, whatever I'm talking about will not happen within our professional lifetime. It takes a while, and particularly, none of what I'm talking about is going to be practical. But it's not impractical. It might be a little esoteric, if you will. And although I don't think you're here to join a cult, I think there is a shared belief in the room that international education and mobility is a moving target. So in a sense, that's, I'll try to look at the ecosystem through a bit more of that kind of esoteric angle. And Kathleen in DAAD really offered just a great line or prompt for that, as moving targets really suggest this idea of an infinite game. And this is not just it's a serious thing. I mean, infinite game theories, even if you study computer science, are a thing. And effectively, what I'd like for you to remember is that in a finite game, there is sort of one specific goal that you want to achieve, and after that, you will call it success. In an infinite game, the design of the game is that you need to continue to play. And I think this really represents a bit of the high-level framing, or what we're doing, trying to build out this global credentialing ecosystem. So let's get to hyperstition. Right, I have to give credits to a researcher. Her name is Primavera De Filippi, who I met in New York recently around the Transforming Education Summit. And she turned me on to this word. I mean, words really are important and have deep meanings. And I thought this one was particularly fitting for the credentialing ecosystem. And in fact, I mean, in a sense, hyperstition is just an idea that can manifest into reality, all right? This is a bit of a fuller definition, which is not a full definition, because there are different takes on this word. But what I like to call out is that this is sort of the science behind self-fulfilling prophecies. So it has to do with positivity to creating your own reality. And if you want to look at some examples of it, policymaking is very hyperstitious. Like you need to be very confident about policies for them to become practice or to go into effect. You need to trust them a lot. Another example is what happened with the idea of cyberspace. It was just really a fictional thing that became a reality, and everything that went along with it. So I hope you'll be talking about hyperstition more and more in the days and months to follow. I said I was going to be esoteric, so let's start with the Trinity. This is not going to be blasphemic in any ways, but there are three fundamental aspects of this ecosystem. One is pantheism. So the spirit here is the fact that you need to believe in everything. There is a sense that diversity is a value, and so people come at the issues from different angles, and there could be multiple solutions to the same problem. So you really need to worship and be tolerant of many ideas. There's a word for it. It's pantheism. It's a religion. The body is really about coordination. Some of the interoperability and technical interoperability work that we're doing is really about human coordination. Standards making is just really setting the mechanics so that we can build consensus, which means agree with each other. The manifestation of that are technical specifications, but it's about human coordination. And really the mind here is a concept that goes beyond sustainability into regenerative mindsets. This is, in other words, things that create positive externalities. So we may suggest to UNESCO to go beyond sustainable development goal into regenerative development goals. This is also a moving target. Even all our policies that have framed, or provided harmonization for higher education as set goals, very finite goals that, have not been met. And then before those goals have not been met, then we just up the game and look farther, 10 years ahead, and, we set new goals. So, but the thought here is that we need to really keep a regenerative mindset. This is building ecosystem that creates positive externalities, or in other words, that are very synergistic. Let's fly over the credentialing landscape a little bit. I'll share a few tools that could be helpful in getting the lay of the land or positioning some of the things that we throw around in the ecosystem. But first of all, why this is important? Well, apparently, new credentials, alternative credentials, are one of the major trends moving forward in across education and work. So the research says here, Holon IQ particularly. How much this is worth? Well, just the alternative credentialing side, which includes different actors, not just higher education, is kind of a $10 billion thing in the next 10 years. This is a pretty big number. It's fragmented and articulated, but to give you a sense, there's a lot of value here, so we're not just trying to reinvent the wheel. And when I was speaking about ecology, I was referring to research work done by Mark Brown at Dublin City University a couple of years ago. I think this chart kind of helps, or used to help, in getting a sense of what all these types of credentials that we're talking about are and how they relate to each other. This was a first compass, to kind of find your way around this emergent landscape. We often talk about lifelong learning, and when we do that, I think we are really meaning lifelong and life-wide. So life-wide means, in the flow of everything that we do, we are going through different learning experiences. We may work, take an online class, and do some community service, go to events. That is, at every moment we are learning, So it's not just over the course of a lifetime, but at every moment, there are different dimensions. And similarly, when we talk about credentials, we don't emphasize enough this concept of recognition, which I think is just a delightful way of thinking about credentials. And recognition is more empowering. It has more social use cases, but it says that there is a spectrum across formal and informal learning, right? But then there's another axis, which is formal and informal recognition. The credentialing technologies, digital credentials that we use, could be applied to different quadrants of this chart here. But I guess the line that summarizes it here is from a research called Axel Honneth that says that recognition precedes cognition. So we're all natively born with the power to recognize, which is a twist to the commonly used term of recognition, at least when we talk about recognition in our context often. And just to end up with creating a bit more chaos with the tools, the conversation around micro-credentials, digital credentials, verifiable credentials is very vibrant and chaotic, but there is a key to interpret it. And so this was another take of making sense of, where are the overlaps between all these kind of credentials. This is a kind of a work done by originally Doug Belshaw in the UK and revisited by Don Prezant from the UK. And really at 50,000 feet or 10,000 meters, whatever that is, there is a lot happening already in the ecosystem. The Groningen Declaration Network is a great forum that has been bringing together different initiatives, nodes of this global network that exchange data and that define standards for it. So this is just a quick snapshot to give you a sense that this is really a global thing, and we should consider it at that level. All right, I wanted to share some of my personal mental models around hyperstitioning in the credentialing ecosystem. And mental models are often very, very simple, and you'll see why. So credentials have to be usable first. That's pretty straightforward. But this thing here, making credential usable, really speaks to the product. How do we develop it? And whether the technology that we are developing is, solves the problem that we're trying to solve. So it's fit for purpose, in other words. So usable is the first U. Useful is really referring to the learners. I mean, we want these credentials to be turned into opportunities. They serve a purpose. And often we forget that. So these credentials should be useful for the learners. Learners should be centric, and for them to be centric, it means that what we're doing, what we're giving them, are actually valuable. And lastly, they should be used. And this speaks more to the ecosystem and to some extent to the adoption dilemma. So far, we've spent a lot of time, a lot of efforts on focusing on issuing these credentials. What types of credentials, can they be issued? Can they be digitized? Could you push them in a wallet? But there's not been enough attention to how these credentials are consumed or adopted in a sense. So one thing is the adoption of a technical specification, but one thing is then the adoption of credentials for a purpose, to unlock opportunities. So again, this is a first mental model. Credentials should be, let's go through them again, usable, useful, and used. If we take this and we try to project it out into a framework or an approach of innovation for credentials, I wanted to share a shameless plug. This is a way to sort of visualize the journey of credentials and what could be the stepping stones or going from 0 to 100 in implementing digital credentials. And this is from Parchment, the company that I work for. And so, as you can read here, it basically goes through, first you go from paper to digital, then with digital you try to do things that were not possible with paper before. You start to develop new pathways around learning, connecting these credentials. You want to communicate more content, and this is certainly enabled by having data inside, machine readable data. You can aggregate this data together and come up with interesting views at the credentials. And very importantly, make it actionable. This, again, speaks to that adoption conundrum or the adoption dilemma. We want to use these credentials for a purpose. They should unlock opportunities, whether you are on an employability pathway to get a job or on an enrollment pathway to further study. But there's one thing, if there's one thing about this ecosystem that should be centralized, against the popularity of decentralized everything, it's on the learner. So learner centricity is very important. And I sometimes use this other term, which is gravitas, which to me gives it a bit more agency. And it was what I was commenting on earlier, that learners can definitely become that proxy of truth. I mean, there's the shift in agencies that they have, their sovereignty that they acquire comes with a responsibility, but definitely this should be recognized by all other actors in the ecosystem, like human resources or like admission officers. In a visual of this into a learner record, it's very simple. This is just a way that I have suggested. So learner and employment records, also known as LERs, just to throw another acronym your way, should really be comprehensive in a sense. It's not just about your academic experiences, but anything that is meaningful in your life that can be represented and you want to share with others, and also should be interoperable. This clearly speaks more to the technology, the fact that a credential issued by a university should be interoperable or recognized by, applicant tracking system at companies or by admission system at other universities. So there's this, again, nuanced mindset, which is the self-sovereign one that we talked about. It means learners at the center and a distributed attitude. The ecosystem is widespread and fragmented, and we want these credentials to be able to serve it well. So the mental model that I shared earlier is kind of basic. It belongs to the here and now, I think, and makes sense. It's probably too simplistic to some extent. But in looking at the new era of the internet, I wanted to suggest or to run this by you as another model. So think of it as a layered model, where layer 0 is identity. Layer 1 is credentials, and layer 2 is really reputation. I'm very happy that this morning we kicked off with a talk on reputation, because I think this is very important. And I'd like to kind of explain what I mean. So often when we talk about credentials, we start from credentials and we roll up to identity very soon. And identity is a difficult thing to solve, but it's there. Identity here means identifiers, like your student ID. But an identifier becomes your identity when it's augmented by a credential, what you can do, what you know. So an identifier plus a credential becomes your identity. But that thing is kind of static, in a sense. And even when we look at the state of things, or be able to assess, or to wanting to add verifiability to credentials is not trivial, but we know how to do it. I think if you look at complexity theories, I don't know if it's a complicated or a complex problem, I don't remember, but there's a nuanced difference there. Like, we know what the solution is, it's just hard to get to it, all right? And typically we talk about verifiability. I think the interesting stuff about reputation comes really as a side effect of thinking about skills-based everything. So we talk about skills-based learning, skills-based hiring, but in a sense, a verifiable credential, I mean, we talk about skills as currency, right? But those attestations are quite static, and I wanted to add this additional nuance which touches on the reputation layer, which is liquidity. So if currency today, if skills today are currency, tomorrow they need to be more liquid. And what I mean is this: if we today present a credential that is verified, it may be a credential that is old. The attestation is legit, is authentic, but what if I've not practiced that? I think we live in a world that is abundant now with data points. And as we learned again this morning, these data points are noisy. So we need to be able to sift the signal from the noise. Again, it's a complicated problem, right? But there's hope. We heard about that. But think about being able to attach these signals of reputations, your endorsement, praises, upvotes, anything that you could collect socially from the internet, append that to a credential. That effect, it becomes a proxy of performance. So with reputation, you can actually make that currency more liquid and more current, because you have this vast amount of data that could be connected to your skills. Therefore, it makes them more current, more liquid. You can spend them more easily. And so reputation, that reputation layer, I think is going to be an interesting challenge ahead for us in sort of looking at this mental model from identity to credentials and reputation. Skills are cash, and they should be very liquid. They should go into actions. We talk about evidence-based learning. We want evidence of learning. Again, reputation provides us sort of these signals of performance that could be a proxy for our credentials and our ability to do what is that we claim we can, even if it's verifiable. I had to have a slide on nano-credentials, because originally when Kathleen and I were talking, I said, hey, I want to talk about nano-credential. But this has evolved a little bit. So two things I want to say. The first is that, you know, a credential is a credential is a credential. I got this line from, I think, in the more institutional world, we talk about a degree is a degree is a degree, something like that. But from the technical perspective, you know, it doesn't really make that much difference. But nano-credentials came from sort of the reflection that goes back to what I was talking about in reputation, and that is really, really emphasized by what's happening right now on the web. Some call it Web 3, some call it Web 5, some just call it the future, you know, of the internet. We live in a world that is increasingly more decentralized. People no longer work for a company, but people work on different projects at the same time. So the issue of portability becomes very important. And in this emergent structures called decentralized autonomous organization, effectively people joining up in communities, they've really been using, again, adoption, credentials, nano-credentials, they call them tokens, but they're nano-credentials, as very powerful means to incentivize actions, to recognize learning and engagement. Those are very cool uses of credentials that were in the original design of some of these digital credentials that are actually available today. And in sort of, I just want to slightly touch on micro-credential without getting down that rabbit hole. But there's an interesting effect that I wanted to share with you that I think represent what's happening with micro-credentials. And it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And effectively it says that, typically, when something shows up, in the market, we all love it and we all feel, yeah, that's easy. I know all about micro-credential, right? And then as time goes on and you dig into it, you're like, oh, maybe that wasn't that easy, right? It's actually quite difficult. I'll never understand it. At some point you go through that, disillusionment. But, you really build up confidence over time with research and peer learning, which is really what's happening with micro-credentials. And there's hope. So eventually this curve picks up and we go into more of a true confidence space. And so if I were to position ourselves today in this chart, I think we probably are, on ramping up again. So again, this, I think, effect explains what's happening with micro-credentials. So be confident, we're going to get there. I mentioned that some of the interesting uses of digital credentials that were originally designed haven't really been fully adopted, and that the Web3 world is showing us what you could really do. Use cases that are not just credentialing, but are more on the recognition spectrum. They are empowering. They build communities. They look at credentials not as collectors of skills, but as connectors of people. And I've been arguing that for a long time that open badges are the ancestor of modern recognition technologies. And I talk about open badges because that is something that hopefully most of you are familiar with. It's a credentialing technology that is available now, that is mature, and that is actually very fit to support any micro-credentialing strategies. And to kind of give you, explain why badges have gone on this journey, I think the Amara's law helps to, again, make sense of their own journey and of other technologies. And essentially, Amara's law says that we typically tend to overestimate technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. It's a curve that goes like this. So I think badges for a long time have been, kept out of academia. They've been laughed at as Boy Scout badges, but all of a sudden now we're reconsidering that. And all of a sudden, if you look at where organizations are using credentialing technologies to support their micro-credentialing strategies, often they're using open badges. This is across corporate and academia. Badges are very mature right now. And they're being widely adopted. There's millions of badges being thrown around. And the good thing, and this kind of justifies why I'm saying that badges are the ancestor of modern recognition technologies, open badges are becoming verifiable credentials. There's a technical nuance there, which is this. Open badges is a technical standard that is stewarded by an organization called One Ed Tech, which is the artist formerly known as IMS Global. Verifiable credentials is another technical standard that is stewarded by the World Wide Web Consortium of W3C. We heard about verifiable credentials before. And in the next version of Open Badges, which has just been published this week, version 3, is becoming a verifiable credential. So it's going to be fit for the future. And this is an incredibly powerful signal of the maturity and the sort of future-proofness, if there is such word, of open badges. Something else that has been shocking the industry is this conversation around, let's call them soulbound tokens or non-transferable NFTs. Which I like to call them programmable verifiable credentials. But a while ago, this year, a popular figure in the crypto space, Vitalik Buterin, and other authors came up with this paper called the Decentralized Society, and they introduced this notion of soul-bound tokens, which are NFTs that are non-transferable, and they can be used for many things. Now, the hype around crypto, and not just the hype, I mean, some of the interesting stuff happening had shifted the attention to NFTs, and so the community that was working on verifiable credentials, the technical folks, started to polarize in camps, and so there's been this discourse emerging between, can NFTs or soul-bound tokens be used for academic credentials? Can they not? Why yes and why not? I think the important thing here is, first of all, we're not at a solution yet. But we should recognize that the conversation needs to happen. And the best way to have this conversation is to typically seek common ground first. The second thing is you have to lean into the friction points, so not afraid of debating. But third and most importantly, you have to use massive doses of humble intelligence. It's not about being in your own camp. It's about, seeing what this could bring to the future. And frankly, I mean, I'm an original gangster of open badges and verifiable credentials. I think NFTs are actually good for verifiable credentials. If there's so much attention and everyone is jumping on it, there must have been something wrong that we did in promoting and pushing for adoption of verifiable credentials. So maybe, by leveraging this conversation, we could actually get way more people into verifiable credentials, tell them why they're good, when it's feasible to use one type of technology, verifiable credentials, and instead when you could use NFTs, for example. In a sense, this is about human coordination. It's a discourse that needs to happen. It's the human interoperability that is important, but also the technical one. So how are we trying to bridge this conversation and work toward interoperability? Well, we recently hosted, when I say we, I mean the worldwide W3C Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force and Jobs for the Future, which is an organization in the US. We are hosting a series of interoperability plug fest. So we bring together players in this ecosystem, issuing organization, wallet providers, to showcase that using these new technical specifications, they can actually talk to each other. So we're not building an ecosystem that is fragmented and that doesn't talk to each other. Those three numbers there are important because just a couple of weeks ago at the in co-location with the Internet Identity Workshop, we had about 30 different issuers, issuing organizations, and 20 different wallet providers that sort of got together and worked across more than 130 different combinations of interoperability. Some said that was the most important interoperability event of the year. I'm glad to hear that, but that's only sort of phase 2. There are different phases planned. So, in building human interoperability, we also, of course, need to have a sort of effect on the tech that we're building every day. So we need more interoperability, and we need more plugfest, which have this positive connotation as being very fun event, which they were. Just to give you a quick snapshot of these are some of the players in that particular plugfest. Without getting into the technical details, BCAPI, which was mentioned before, is one of the protocols that you use to exchange these verifiable credentials. There are at least 3, BCAPI being one, another one is called OpenID Connect, and another one is called DIDComp. But BCAPI is probably the most popular right now. Okay, I said this was going to be esoteric, so I wanted to kind of go back into that mood and reflect on the sacred geometry of trust and play on this acronym that is becoming very popular, which is SSI, which stands for self-sovereign identity in literature. I twisted it a little bit and I called it Stoic sovereign identity. So what I have up here is the magic triangle of trust. The World Wide Web Consortium has come up with this figure. This is a model that really represents the interactions in the ecosystem. So you have issuers, you have holders and verifiers that play with each other. And this is why I call it Stoic sovereign identity. That mental model is the basic of self-sovereign identity technologies. But back in Stoic years, the same triangle was used to express Stoicism. And so effectively, Stoicism really talked about interesting principles that are also the ones that we have in the technology today, like being in charge of what you're doing. Have that take responsibility for your action, the agency, in ownership, and sort of live with positive attitude toward life, which recalls somehow the hyperstition idea. So history repeats itself, but when you find that there are some fundamental principles or primitives on which we're building new technologies for the future that appeared centuries ago, I think that's sort of a good signal that you're on a good path. Shameless plug. The company that I used to work for called Digitalisation that was acquired by Parchment last year had it in its name early on. So in 2005, Digitalisation adopted this triangle of trust as a thing before it became popular, before verifiable credentials came about. But I just thought, these for me were all pointers to say, hey, this is a mature mental model for building trust in technologies around credentials for the future, and it's here to stay. Yesterday, we heard this call for decolonizing education, right? And I thought it was very interesting. That resonated with me a lot, like with many of you, I believe. And in a sense, I was thinking, is there a difference between decolonizing and indigenizing things? I felt that when we talk about decolonizing, like we have to unlearn what we did. We have to do something different. But indigenizing was more of let me get inspired and excited about something new that I don't know and just take off on that tangent. It feels like it's more natural to do that, rather to sort of have second thoughts on what I've been doing so far. So in that effort, I wanted to share with you these fundamental principles that I think it's the real key in building ecosystem. And it comes from the Zulu tradition. So this is my play to indigenize this conversation. And it is represented by the word Ubuntu. Does anyone know what Ubuntu really means? Naveen? All right, cool. It's that, and the way, the definition that resonated with me was, I am because we are. And so that is kind of a fundamental principles that we could use to go from this idea of ecosystem, which we find ourselves into a lot, given whether it is our egos around the technologies that we use or our institutions and so on, into more ecosystem. So it's the move from ecosystem to ecosystem that should really happen. And again, fundamentally, I think one example of this that it's really happening in Europe is this initiative of European universities. So these are universities that are coming together to form a new super university that may be issuing in the future European degrees that are joint degrees on steroids, but they work together on shared projects. Many of them are focusing on micro-credentials, for example. And I think this is going to create, I hope, a subtle shift in our own identity. So we will no longer feel or present ourselves as graduates of one organization, but maybe one individual institution, but possibly in the future, we will be talking about how we graduated from a European university. Now, some of you may have been on a mobility experience abroad. If you went across the pond, as they say, so in North America, you will likely have experienced, like I have, this sense of Europeanness. When you are in Europe, we tend to look at your French, you're Italian, and you're Spanish. Our food is greater than yours, is better than yours. Your wine is certainly better. Yeah, French have the best wine, I would say. But there's that identity kind of changes. And so when you move outside of your own boundaries, then you feel more connected to the wider ecosystem. So your identity becomes more European. At the time, for me, it was, oh, where are all the Europeans? And we would gather up, and that was our identity. We shared a lot. And it was kind of to pin that against the American culture back then, but those were the days. So European universities, I think, are great examples of how we are in practice trying to move from ecosystem to ecosystem in our world. And an expression, ultimately, of really what it means to put into practice this Ubuntu, or I am, because we are. We started by saying that moving target is really about an infinite game where the real objective is to continue to play. And a play on that, a twist on that, is just this artistic symbol that was created by an Italian architect called Michelangelo Pistoletto, which is called the Third Paradise. And I think this is probably as fitting as possible to what I wanted to talk to you today about. And it says, he added another circle or twist to the infinite symbol. So we have three. And so on one side, you have me, io. The other side, tu, you. And in the middle, it's noi, which is we. So I think in playing infinite games, this could be an interesting icon that comes back, and hopefully we'll be able to assess whether we've been able to go from kind of ecosystem to ecosystem in the future. And the way you do that is really by going out and hyperstitioning more. So thank you for staying a bit esoteric with me today. That's all I have. Thank you.